so these are the kinds of texts that were often held up, right? Some of these passages were often preached in settings in which the enslavers were attempting to keep the enslaved in their position, right? So
dynamic biblical discussions with special guests exploring tough biblical issues, academic scholarship, ethics, archaeology, textual criticism, Old Testament, New Testament, Bible interpretation, apocalyptic literature, Christian history, ancient Near East cultures. You're tuned in to Conversations with Pastor Cliff on Puluso Ministries.
Good day, everybody. Welcome back to another episode on Puluso Ministries with Conversations with Pastor Cliff. And today we have an awesome guest, and his name is Professor Emerson Powery, and he is at Messiah University, and he focuses mainly on the New Testament in terms of his research and his writing. He has written several books, such as The Genesis of Liberation, and Jesus Read Scripture, and True to Our Native Land, which is an African-American New Testament commentary. And I certainly hope that we're going to have an awesome conversation with him in unpacking some of the issues that we find in some of his books, that he can sort of help us in terms of understanding what he has written and how it helps us to move forward as Christians in general. Welcome, Professor Powery, on to Puluso Ministries.
yeah, thank you, Pastor Cliff, for inviting me into this conversation. I look forward to our conversation this morning.
Great. Before we dive into it, I would like you to perhaps give a bit of a background to, who you are and why you're doing the type of work that you are doing, because it's, not everybody does what you do, in terms of the work. Yeah. Why are you doing what you do, and a bit of background.
Yeah. I actually, when I started studies at the undergraduate level, I started off in aviation. So it's kind of doing technical studies, and I was really interested in the business side of aviation. But I have a long history in my family of people who have gone into various capacities in ministry, and felt sort of a tug in that direction, although not necessarily to pastor. So I went and finished up after my first degree in aviation, went to seminary, and then went on and secured my doctorate degree in the study of early Christianity. At that time, during those studies, I really became interested in a number of facets of early Christianity and biblical studies. But particularly, I became interested in how later peoples, and here I was thinking in my dissertation work, how later early Christians, how they wrestled with Scripture. Their Scripture would have been what we would call the Old Testament. So for them, it was an engagement with those Scriptures in their world, in their context, in new settings. That then opened up my own interest in thinking about even how later people, later contemporaries, right? So growing up in the Christian church, I was often engaged in reading Scripture, reading practices, but never really thought very seriously and intentionally about how those practices were carried out until I started doing kind of this pretty focused work in my dissertation research. And so that opened up lots of questions that led to the Genesis book, where 19th century enslaved folks, how they engage text, and how various other individuals and communities, the way they lived and engaged Scripture. So that's just kind of a little snapshot of how I got to where I think about the kinds of questions I think about now.
Okay, fantastic. And in your book, The Genesis of Liberation, you have a subtitle there, and you name it The Biblical Interpretation in the Antebellum Narratives of the Enslaved, which you obviously published in 2016. And tell me, maybe many of our audience may not understand what you mean by this term antebellum, because we're in South Africa and in the States, so they may not quite understand what you mean by that. Hooking it to our topic today, where in terms of talking about the Bible as a source of liberation. What do you make of the term? What does it mean?
Yeah, so there were a lot of discussions prior to mine talked about the engagement with religion, particularly with Christian religion in the 19th century, uh, surrounding the Civil War. So the American Civil War from 1861 to 1865 is kind of a turning point around issues of enslavement, human bondage in this country, in the US. Um, some of those discussions, I would say, do not necessarily think so particularly about uh, engagement around religious themes and religious sources prior to the war compared to those religious themes and engagements with scriptures after the war. So antebellum, prior to the war, uh, my investigation was to focus primarily on what have been called slave narratives. Uh, Narratives, stories about human bondage from the perspective of the former slave. And I wanted to break up these. There's about 110, depending on how you count, 110 to 120 of these narratives throughout the 19th century. And I really focused primarily on about 60 of them that were published prior to the Civil War in 1861, because I discovered that there are some different themes that are occurring in those narratives, even though the authors of all of those narratives, whether before the war or after the war, the author of all of those narratives were people who had escaped human bondage or were now free. And so within the book, we actually stopped calling them slave narratives and we call them freedom narratives, because they're written by people who were formerly enslaved and who are now free, telling that story. So, but the antebellum narratives became of particular interest to us in that research, because there were things that we found and we saw that were distinctive of those antebellum pre-Civil War narratives with respect to biblical interpretation, with respect to the Bible.
Fantastic. What I'm picking up and what is coming right out when I looked at some of your work is that the people who were enslaved would have obviously embraced the text or the belief of those who had enslaved them. And why would you think people who were enslaved would sort of embrace this type of faith that was sort of pressing them down?
Yeah, and this is a really, really important question, and one that I think is there's no simple answer to this one, right? So there are a number of people. Yolanda Pierce, recently, she's a historian and an ethicist here in the U.S. And I heard her recently say, and I like this language, it's not that necessarily that they adopt it, they certainly adopted that religion, the Christian religion of their enslavers, but they also adapted it, right? So adopt it and adapt it. And I find that language to be more useful, I think, to what folks, so they were these, the people who were enslaved were hearing these stories, biblical stories, and they could then reimagine those stories for their own lives in different ways, right? And so when you hear about God leading the people of Israel out of Exodus, right, in the book of Exodus, out of bondage, you start to imagine what that God might do for you, right? So I think there were parts of the story that really were that became more significant to them than other parts of the story. So I think they were adopting and adapting at the same time, that story, and were able to tap into the Christian religion as one that brought them not just solace in the middle of their suffering, but allowed them to think about their own suffering in different ways, right? So, and I think, yeah, so people who read even scripture today, who might be reading it to a sage to assist them with experiences of suffering, find hope in those passages, find ways of kind of working through the suffering, working through the struggle, working through, right? So I think in a similar way, formerly or the enslaved, while they were in enslavement, were finding those experiences. Even while they couldn't read, they could hear the story. and they would hear the story and then reimagine their own kind of experience in relationship to that story.
Okay.
And that, and yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah,
so
go ahead. Sorry.
that's fascinating how you actually put it. So in my understanding, is that these people are hearing these stories because many of them couldn't necessarily were not fluent readers, if I put it that way, of the biblical text. So they were actually hearing this in maybe in a sermon kind of setup where there'll be someone else who's more learned would actually be teaching them this information. Now tell me, when this happens, are they taking perhaps some of the New Testament texts and sort of reinterpret them how they would have looked at the previous stories that would have happened, particularly in the Old Testament, what biblical interpretation would label as intertextuality? Would I be right to say that?
Yeah, no, I think that's right. I think this is a form of intertextuality in which you are putting parts of stories, right, or themes from stories. When you hear Moses, you also attach Jesus, right? So Jesus and Moses become in some ways a similar character, if not the same character for many of them, right? And part of what that meant is Moses and Jesus are both leading people out of their struggle, out of their suffering, out of their bondage. And whether you interpret that as physical, like in Moses's case, or spiritual, as in perhaps Jesus's case, depending on how you read certain passages in Jesus, for them there was a thematic connection for them, and how they interpreted those passages that gave them a sense of peace, a sense of even usefulness in the middle of their struggle.
Okay.
And so, yeah, but I would agree with you that is kind of a form of intertextuality, that kind of engagement with texts and stories and themes, and then their own experience, right? So,
Awesome.
yeah.
So what I'm getting here is that they are reimagining these texts, particularly in the context in which they find themselves, and which is not very strange as to what Jesus would have done in reading some of these Old Testament texts during his time, because during Jesus's time, the reading would have been much more the Old Testament, as many Christians would know it today. So in ways that Jesus would have looked at these texts, he would have reimagined these texts and given them a sort of a new meaning to them in terms of reinterpreting how the previous generations would have understood these texts. And I see kind of a parallel there between what Jesus is doing and what these previously enslaved people would have done with texts.
Yeah, no, that's right. Even in my dissertation work, which was published as Jesus Reads Scripture, I actually had a footnote that became for me kind of a theoretical, kind of a way of opening up this relationship between Jesus and text, Jesus and Scripture, and what he was doing. But for me it was a footnote that came from Sojourner Truth, right? A 19th century figure who, as far as we know historically, she was multilingual. She could speak 3 languages fluently, but she couldn't read.
Wow.
But yet her statement was, I do not read such small things as letters. I read men and nations, right?
Wow.
And so, yeah, and for me, that became kind of a theoretical framework for thinking about what Jesus was doing with Scripture. I felt like within the Gospels, Jesus's way of analyzing and working with the biblical text, the scriptural text, within synagogues and in public, seemed broader than some of the contemporary rabbis, which were focused on how to manage this phrase or that phrase, perhaps. But Jesus would often use a passage of Scripture and then tell a story, tell a parable, right? So he would use a contemporary experience to kind of put in conversation with that scriptural text,
Yeah.
and that's a form of intertextuality that kind of opens up, I think, broader conversations.
Awesome.
To ensure that we keep bringing you tough conversations like these, please support our ministry by donating as little as 50 Rand per month. You can find our banking details on our website, pulusoministries.co.za.
I like that. But now, Powery, when you look at these texts, you always find texts that are, I would say, problematic, particularly from the lens of Paul. If someone doesn't actually read Paul correctly, I don't know what that means, though.
Yeah.
And you often have texts that say, slaves, obey your masters. How are those kind of texts read or understood in this kind of context?
Yeah. So these are the kinds of texts that were often held up, right? Some of these passages were often preached in settings in which the enslavers were attempting to keep the enslaved in their position, right? So prior to the 19th century, there's this long history of struggle among white Christians and those who are kind of engaged in the practices of slavery. There's a struggle among them about how much Christian faith should they give to the enslaved, right? So there's a real interesting, I mean, this has gone on for a couple of centuries prior to the 19th century, where they're just constantly disagreeing with one another about those issues, because some would say that the Christian faith would make people more obedient and more docile, and others were saying, no, if they get certain parts of the Christian faith around issues of freedom, they might hear something else. So there's a really interesting debate that's going on, and Paul is certainly part of that history. So when we get to the 19th century, and there's lots within the slave narrative tradition, there are lots of stories that these authors tell about showing up in services. Harriet Jacobs tells this great story, great because it's the way she retells it, about this Reverend Pike. There's a person by the name of Reverend Pike. He's a white enslaver, and he is preaching a message which includes slaves obey your masters, and he's telling people not only when you disobey your master, not only you're disobeying your master, you're also disobeying God, right? So he's putting those kinds of themes together. And Harriet Jacobs tells this story and says that at the end, what the slaves did after they heard the message was they all got up and departed, right? They got up and left when the service was over, saying to one another, that's not the gospel, right? So Harriet Jacobs tells this fascinating story that fits into this context where they were hearing these kinds of messages, but somehow the enslaved understood or found a way to reinterpret those stories and to say, well, that doesn't really sound like gospel news to us.
Yeah.
So they would just reject it. Others would do some interesting things with someone like Paul. So there's some there's evidence that there was this that they would find the other Paul. Let's call it the Paul of Acts, right? So for them, they wouldn't quite distinguish the Paul of the letters from the Paul of Acts the way people might do in critical biblical studies today. But they did have this way of appreciating the Paul that they saw in the book of Acts. So, for example, God has made from one ancestor all the nations of the world. Acts 17, right? What became known as the One Blood Doctrine. Lots of people would talk about the One Blood Doctrine, even in the Capitol in the U.S. There are people standing up and using this passage out of Acts 17, I think it's verse 26, as a way of kind of attempting to promote more equality, right? So they understood that there's another side to Paul, and they would prefer to use that side if possible. So somehow they knew enough about, or had heard enough about some of these other stories, that they were able to either manage what they heard, or to push back against what they heard, or to reinterpret what they heard in ways that it became more conducive for them. Yeah.
Okay, and tell me, which kind of books would they have emphasized in terms of balancing their spirituality and moving forward in the struggle in which they find themselves in? What were the strongest books that they would focus or emphasized? Yeah,
that's a good question. In our book, The Genesis of Liberation, we listed, I think it was 15 or 18 of the top ones that were showing up in the in the slave narratives. As I think about this now, 5 years after the publication, 7 years after all the hard work that went into that project, I think I have found myself thinking a little differently about this. So I think they were less interested in particular books and more interested in particular themes. And part of it has to do with what you mentioned earlier, Pastor Cliff, that many of them could not read. I mean, the numbers are somewhere like in 4 to 5%, 4 to 6%. James Hope Franklin, an American historian who's passed away a number of years ago, but he's written us, he's a major kind of historian of African American history. He puts the numbers there, and he says, and I think I myself might be putting the numbers a little high, so the number is so low that I think it wasn't necessarily books necessarily as themes.
All right.
So if they could find freedom and hope and peace and those kinds of things, that's where they went. So they found passages like that. So someone, for example, I did an article a number of years ago now on Harriet Jacobs and the Bible, which is a short article that's actually separate from the book, but leading up to the book. And one of the things that fascinated me was her engagement with Job. So Job, and when I read Job, I know I'm not hearing what the 19th century enslaved were hearing.
Yeah.
But for some reason, Job was really popular at Black funerals. And it had to do with phrases like, where there's weary and suffering, but the weary shall be at rest, right? It's out of Job, I think Job 27. So I mean, there are these phrases and themes that they pick up that become prominent in how they think about kind of the whole. So I think they were reading, right? It's more like they saw the Bible not necessarily as a collection of books, but the Bible kind of as a whole. And so the themes of it, however the themes would strike them, would be what would be more important.
All right, I see. Yeah. And tell me, in this understanding that they would have had, obviously from repeated sermons, they definitely would have developed great memories, because if you're not reading a text, you sort of grasp the text from word of mouth and from what you hear on the pulpit, if there was a pulpit at all at the time. And also, do you think that texts that emphasize the resurrection of the dead, would there have been something that they would have embraced strongly, or not? What is your take on it?
Yeah, so this is an interesting discussion too in this particular topic area. One of the reasons why we divided out the antebellum narratives, the narratives before the war, the Civil War, and those after, is because a theme like the resurrection is less prominent before the war. So they tell these stories looking for solace, certainly longing for freedom, but resurrection wasn't yet kind of on the horizon, right? So in the post-bellum narratives, resurrection is a prominent theme in the way people manage scripture. This is also true not just about the narratives, but also about the spirituals. In the spirituals, there are songs, these songs that get sung, the slave songs that get sung often focus on certainly freedom and release, but also, suffering of Jesus as one who is like us. So there's a focus there, and very little, and this is not, I haven't done this kind of work on the spirituals, but I looked at enough spirituals. David Goatley, my brother, wrote a book on the spirituals, Luke Powery, Cheryl Kirk-Dugan, Howard Thurman, James Cone has a book on the spirituals, and all of them mention the lack of resurrection in the spirituals, in the songs. And I found that to be fascinating, because that's analogous to what's happening. That's an analogy to what's happening in the slave narratives prior to the Civil War. And I think it's just because of the collective experience, right? So it's not as if they couldn't see heaven. They could see heaven, right, which was an end for suffering. And sometimes heaven and the north were attached together, kind of in double language in some of their singing. but the idea that they would resurrect out of human bondage into freedom was more difficult to imagine. So, and I think that has a lot to do with kind of the experience of Christianity that they were hearing from their enslavers, right? So,
Yeah,
I don't think, I don't think their enslavers were preaching resurrection to them as
yeah,
right, as a
yeah.
useful way of thinking about their lives. So,
I see. I see. And now that's something that sort of sparks me as we talking about this. I find that often people tend to hook their pre-existing beliefs onto some biblical texts, and you would see texts like the case of Ham, which becomes significant during the time of the antebellum, enslavement of the people. And why do you think the enslavers would have, strongly gravitated towards the text to sort of accomplish their mission?
yeah, no, that's a great question, right? So, I mean, proof texting has always been part of the Christian experience, right? This is this is a global phenomenon throughout the history of Christianity.
Maybe before you answer that, maybe you just mentioned the term proof texting. Maybe some of our audience may not know what we mean by that term. Did you clarify?
So proof texting is finding a passage and perhaps more than likely pulling it out of its context to make another point. So take, for example, right, there's a lot of conversation around issues of mask. And I've heard lots of passages. I'm thinking of something like in 3 John, there's a passage about, I hope to get together with you and talk face to face. And so some people have taken that out of its context to say we should have no mask mandate because we need to be talking face to face. Well, 3 John, of course, in 3 John's world, that's not part of what that means, right?
Yeah,
So,
yeah.
so proof texting is a common practice where people will take isolated verses out of their larger context to prove some other point. And with the curse of Ham, right? This great story out of Genesis 9 in which Noah is seen by his sons. He has 3 sons, and he's seen by his son Ham. His nakedness is seen by Ham, and then and part of, as readers of that story, we may not be so sure why is that a problem. Why is Ham seeing his father's nakedness a problem? But we're told in the next verse that the other 2 brothers, Shem and Japheth, go in. And they go in backwards, and they with a cloak, and they cover up their father's nakedness. So we know that it's a problem. It's a problem in the story. And then when Noah discovers that Ham saw his nakedness, he curses Canaan, right? He curses the son of Ham, Canaan, and says that Canaan will be a slave to his brothers for in perpetuity for his life, for the rest of his life. So the curse becomes the curse of Ham, sometimes called the curse of Canaan, in the 19th century. And the way 19th century enslavers saw this passage, they attached racial categories to these 3 sons, right? So, and Shem being attached to the people that become the Shemites or Israel, attached to Israel basically, and then Japheth is kind of attached to the European side of the world, and then Ham is attached to the African side of the world. Now, part of what's interesting about that, right? On the one hand, after you read Genesis 9, you get into Genesis 10, and in Genesis 10, we call it the Table of Nations. There is a geographical breakdown of these 3 sons into various people groups, but it's quite, if you map out those people groups, as my colleague who co-authored the Genesis book, Rodney Sadler, his work, his early dissertation work was actually mapping out the Cushites and taking the Genesis 10 Table of Nations and kind of putting, where would all those people groups show up? And it's quite diverse, right? So Ham's people, so to speak, are not all in in the southern part of the Mediterranean world. They actually show up in European parts. Japheth is also divided, and so is Shem. So there's an overlap of these people groups where they are. So something else is going on in the ancient world that probably has something to do with a story about the Canaan, the curse of Canaan, and the people of Israel then going in and having these battle with the Canaanites. The story is probably more likely for that purpose. The 19th century folks took the Ham, Shem, and Japheth, divided up based on their reading, or I would say misreading of these people groups, and then attach racial categories to them, right? So they put together ethnic categories or geographical categories and racial categories, and then they came up with this extraordinary way of thinking about Ham as attached to the black race. So then Noah's curse on Ham/Canaan became a curse on the black race, and therefore that's why blacks could be enslaved.
Yeah, I think that's more of an abuse of scripture when one looks at it, because people can just, impose some of their, preconceived, beliefs and ideas and project them onto scripture, and, basically make scripture to say whatever they wanted to say. And that leads to my next question. Do you think then that the Bible is a good source of liberation? I mean, some people read it that way and say, the Bible is a good source of liberation, and some say, no, it's not. What's your take?
Yeah, so I think, the Bible is both and, right? The Bible can be a source of liberation, and it can be a source for evil. It depends on who's reading it, right? It depends on what a person is attempting to do. It depends on the interpreter's theological presuppositions. It depends on, before they even come to the text. Do you really believe that God is a God of love, and that God created everybody the same, right? So if you believe that, then when you open the biblical text and you have that as a presupposition, then you'll find ways to read it. From my vantage point, you'll find ways to read it correctly, right? So, and there are those who do not read it that way. They have presuppositions. So it's not just what the Bible tells them. It's what the Bible tells them in light of what they've already thought about God before they engage the Bible. So the Bible is, I would say, a neutral book. I would say the Bible cannot speak for itself. The Bible has to have interpreters, right? So the Bible, we could open a passage, and the Bible will not say anything to us until we start to read. And then once we start to read and start to interpret, even reading out loud. One of the things I encourage, we're starting our classes at the university next week, Tuesday. And one of the early lessons I do in the first week is I have students read passages out loud because I want them to hear the tone that they read right? There's certain emphases that they put in certain places, and then they downplay other things, right? So my students don't like to read genealogies, and yet genealogies are so important in the biblical world, right? I mean, take that story of the Table of Nations in Genesis 10. Without understanding what's going on in that genealogy, you just can't skip over that and understand the rest of Genesis. So, but even to hear how people read out loud, the tone of passage, they begin to interpret. The Bible needs interpreters. So I would say, to the specific question, is the Bible a source for liberation? Yes and no, right? The Bible is a neutral book. And I want to ask the interpreters, are you a person who believes in liberation, right? Because if so, then you will be a person who will read the Bible as a source for liberation. So I think it's a complicated issue to be given, particularly in religious communities, in ecclesial communities, in faith communities, to engage the Bible in ways that are true to the the group's commitments to liberation, right? So, and there certainly are difficult passages along the way, right? So the Bible has some difficult things that they want to put forward, uh, but it requires interpretation.
All right.
Yeah, it requires interpretation. It requires a serious engagement with it, both understanding it in its own setting and also understanding it in many ways throughout time as best as possible, how various communities engaged it, how it doesn't come to us. Hans-Georg Gadamer, the great philosopher, used to say that the text, and he was thinking about all ancient texts, but he also has an appendix in which he's thinking about the Bible specifically. He was a Lutheran Christian, right, in Germany in the 60s, and he's writing, and he says that the Bible, he would say the text, does not come to us as a pure text. It comes to us as an interpreted text already, right?
Yeah.
And we ourselves do not come as pure readers or interpreters. We have a world from which we read, right?
Yeah.
And then those two, the text as interpreted and the person as interpreter, connect, and there's this fusion that happens in that process. And lots of things, lots of good things, and some bad things can happen when that fusion occurs.
Yes, yes. No, that's so
but-
true, because what you're saying, you can actually pick it up from how Jesus reads scripture. He sort of has this overarching ethic that he places up as the point of departure, that it has to encourage loving one's neighbor and also loving God. So when you're reading these texts and you're interpreting these texts, because there's no way you can read these texts without interpreting them, but the Jesus kind of lens that he would have sort of engaged scripture, it's kind of the priority that one has to sort of wrestle with. Otherwise, everything just becomes problematic in terms of some of the interpretations that one can arrive at. Would you say I'm correct to say that?
Yes, no, definitely, Pastor Cliff. I think, right, I think it's a good to say love God, love neighbor. I mean, if I think I agree with you there that for Jesus, every engagement with scripture, every engagement with the Bible is an engagement at the end. We should be asking ourselves, after we come to a conclusion about what this means, what does this mean in relationship to the larger lens of loving God and loving neighbor? And if it doesn't feed those, then perhaps we need to reconceive our interpretation, right? We need to rethink what we've just thought we've come up with. So yeah, Jesus says on these two, right? Love God, love neighbor. On these two commandments hang all the prophets, right? So and that's right. That's an excellent kind of model for what I think is happening every time any interpreter engages the Bible. We all have presuppositions. We don't always know. Many of us do not always know what they are, but we have them. They're in place. They come to us out of our social context and out of our lived experiences. And sometimes for some of us, it's easier to see them. And for others, it's more difficult to see them. And that's why I think Scripture should always be engaged in community. A community where we trust one another and we can hear what one another is saying. And if your interpretation is better than mine, and what does it mean by better? I would say if it serves God and the idea of loving God, and it serves the neighbor and the idea of loving neighbor, if it's better in that way, then it's better. Then it's a better interpretation than the one I'm putting forward. So yeah.
It's quite interesting how you place that emphasis on reading scripture in a community, because what I'm picking up is that there is this tradition, as you would call it, in the Jewish perspective, where you have this living tradition on how to interpret these ancient texts. You have the Midrash reading of text, you have the Talmudic reading of text, which sort of embraces these multiple perspectives on how these texts are read. And I find that this is more like a divine or imagination that one has to sort of tap into to keep it going, so that we don't lock it to the past, and also make it meaningful to our present context. That's what I'm getting from you.
Yeah, no, that's a helpful way of thinking, right? So in Jewish communities, I think and even contemporary Jewish communities, one of my best friends I grew up in Miami, Florida, and had lots of Jewish friends. And one of my best friends to this day, he stood in my wedding, is he was a secular Jew. And I say was a secular Jew because then he had children. And after he had children, he decided, well, we wanted to raise them. He was married to a Christian. He said, but we wanted to raise them in both worlds, Christian and the Jewish world. And so he would invite me whenever they had special occasions for the children at the synagogue. And in his particular, he went to a moderate, what we would call kind of a moderate Jewish community. So not an Orthodox one. Orthodox communities, he couldn't marry a Christian. So he was in a moderate Jewish community. But there, whenever I would show up at these gatherings, there was always public readings of Torah, public readings of scripture. And people like my friend, Richard Bush, who could get up because they were all trained in reading. They could read the Hebrew words, even though they couldn't necessarily interpret. They would get up and he would get up there and read a passage from Isaiah or something in Hebrew. And then there would be a discussion, a collective discussion. And I was always, as the only Christian there, big settings, I was always invited to offer my expression of what that might sound like or look like or interpret. How would I think about that? And I always found that so amazing that, here was someone outside of their world that was invited to that conversation. And I think that comes, though, from this sense of the ancient world of Midrash, the ancient world of this kind of a variety of rabbis would interpret a passage, right? So here's the passage of scripture, and then Rabbi Hillel would say this, and Rabbi Shammai would say this, and Eleazar would say, and so, and even in the contemporary synagogue, there's an attention to that there are multiple ways of thinking about how scripture should be heard and interpreted. And so even this Christian that we won't listen to may not know much. We'll even ask him to say a word, So I always found that to be so interesting, so engaging as a way of thinking about how scripture itself is still alive, and even as a tradition, it's a living tradition that one engages from multiple angles in order to come to some collective understanding. And I think that has really, as you pointed out, Pastor Cliff, really, really strong ancient roots. I don't find, at least in my engagement with, again, and I don't engage a lot of Jewish communities, but in my engagement with the few that I have engaged, I've always found them to be very kind of open and willing to kind of talk to Christians who have very different ways of reading the biblical text.
Yeah.
So, and I think they have that kind of history that allows for that.
Right. No, I like that, because what I'm finding is that these type of being open to these multiple perspectives of reading text, and we kind of keep the other traditions that have come before us alive, and also we come up with new ones, but we're not discarding them because we sort of standing in the on the shoulders of those who have come before us, and it makes the text a bit more meaningful because we are aware how these texts were sort of understood in the context prior to our context. So that's very meaningful, I find. And tell me, perhaps as our last question for our conversation for today, how did the Antebellist, the enslaved people view Jesus? How important was Jesus to them in terms of their understanding in dealing with some of the challenges that they would have gone through from day to day?
Yeah, this is also one of the kind of fascinating questions, because there is a famous passage out of Luke chapter 12, and around verse 47, Jesus is actually speaking, and he's telling a parable, and he says that a slave who doesn't obey his master shall be beaten with many stripes, right? And I'm citing the King James version there of that, right? Shall be beaten with many stripes. That was a very popular passage cited. I found at least 8 specific references within the narratives, and you can find that passage dozens and dozens of places outside of the slave narrative tradition. This was a popular passage for enslavers to use. And yet somehow the enslaved didn't connect that passage to Jesus. They just didn't. For them, Jesus stood on the side of the sufferer. Jesus was always on the side of the sufferer. So someone like um, Philip Randolph. Philip Randolph um, he was enslaved and became free quite early. His parents escaped, and he escaped with them. And he wrote his narrative pretty early in the 1850s. And he tells this extraordinary story about enslaved people being taken to the slave auction markets. And he's going through these various characters in his story. And he finally gets to, I believe her name was Ellen. I believe that's right. I think it's Ellen. But he gets to this female character, and he said that as Ellen came up on the slave auction block, it was then that we knew that Jesus was also on the auction block with us. So this Ellen character was described earlier in his story as one who was a person of faith and piety, would never do any wrong, even when done wrong to. But then Randolph made more of her, right? In that auction setting, Jesus was on our side, and then Randolph went on to kind of talk some more about Jesus on the side of the sufferer. And that's how they saw Jesus. That's where they saw Jesus. They saw Jesus on their side. And so no sermon from the enslaver could turn their minds on that. And I think that's part of how they not only adopt it, but adapt it, right? So they were constantly kind of negotiating this interpretation. Interpretation itself became a force for political change, if you will, right? Interpretation itself was kind of not just a spiritual practice. It was a spiritual practice that had bodily implications, right? No separation between those things. You could not just talk about my soul separate from my body. Those things were all hand in hand. And so for these enslavers, they understood Jesus to be on the side of the sufferer, and therefore, when they heard these stories, that was one of their presuppositions. Love God, love neighbor. Jesus is on our side, you know. And so that became an important lens for them before they even came to the biblical stories.
Awesome. I like that because I sort of can relate, as many of our audiences would do the same, because we find ourselves in a context, as you would know, our country, it's more or less similar to what people in the United States would have experienced, us coming from apartheid and, post slavery in the United States. So that kind of sort of plays hand in hand, sort of in understanding how they would have seen this text, or even maybe the oral text is sort of something that people cannot imagine in this day and age, but, something that they had to live through. So I found it very meaningful and helpful. And I certainly hope that our audiences would have enjoyed this conversation and hopefully wrestle with some of these texts that we find ourselves with today in the 21st century. Yeah, thank you very much for taking the time to speak with us. And I know you are busy in the background doing other stuff. Before I let you go, I would like you to probably tell our audience what you're perhaps working on. Where can they also purchase some of your book? Do you have any online presence that they can sort of follow you on?
Yeah, I have a very minimal kind of social media presence. So Emerson B. Powery, I have a Twitter account at Emerson B. Powery, hashtag Emerson B. Powery. I have a new project that I'm actually in the galleys. This is expected out, if not the end of the year, at the beginning of the year, on the Good Samaritan. Oh, and it's a reading of the Good Samaritan through four different contexts, through four different lenses. So I do a St. Augustine in his reading of the Good Samaritan, and then Howard Thurman, who was a prominent African-American preacher in the middle 20th century. And then I do the reading of the Good Samaritan through a Nicaraguan community known as the Solentiname community, and their engagement with the Good Samaritan. And then Harriet Jacobs, who came up a couple times today, Good Samaritan through her context, and those four then set up. They are all actually in one chapter that sets up my reading of the Good Samaritan story in chapter 3, before I then bring it into the contemporary world and talk about Samaritan lives matter too, kind of thing. So that's a recent project that's coming out. I'm also working on a couple of commentaries on Mark and First Corinthians in contextual commentary series. So they take context very seriously. So even though we're doing kind of traditional ways of reading, historical, critical, and paying attention to ancient world, we're also paying attention to contemporary context in these commentaries. And so that's a bit more up my alley in thinking about these texts. So a couple of commentaries, Mark and First Corinthians and the Good Samaritan Project. Yeah.
So that sounds very interesting. Perhaps that could be our next conversation somewhere down the line. Yeah, awesome. Thank you once again for taking the time, and to our audience back at home, I certainly hope you had a wonderful time, with this conversation with Professor Powery. And I certainly hope that you can keep on clicking those like buttons and subscription buttons to keep on getting the feeds as we have these conversations. And until next time, keep tuning in, and goodbye. Bye-bye. Puluso Ministries is a non-profit educational enterprise founded in 2019. The ministry is informed by academic scholarship. At Puluso, we embrace multiple perspectives in our engagement with Scripture. We seek to provide non-Christians and Christians from all backgrounds and denominations with resources that provide an honest intellectual engagement with the Bible. We embrace multiple perspectives in fostering a more open, moderate society into the 21st century and beyond.
To ensure that we keep bringing you tough conversations like these, please support our ministry by donating as little as 50 Rand per month. You can find our banking details on our website, pulusoministries.co.za.